So hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Really excited over the kind of next kind of 50 minutes to an hour about talking about building thriving organisations and teams. It's wonderful to have one of our partners today, Helen Bailey, who is an expert in this field. I'm going to be talking us through actually the reason why it's so important to look from a kind of an ED&I perspective, the benefits to it, but also the importance to really build engagement and build those thriving teams. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. It's very interactive, so Helen's style, which is wonderful from that perspective. So we're going to hand over to Helen in a second. And I'll just do the next slide, if that's okay with you, Helen, just to talk through from our point of view. So I know quite a few on the call already, which I know from that perspective. So just really good news. So we've changed our name only last week. So it used to be Inspiration Coaching Limited. We've now changed to Inspiring Cultures Limited. So where the work that we do is very much now in that cultural space. So you'll see a change from kind of stuff over the next coming weeks. But today, just to talk through, we're really looking at kind of that leadership, that inclusive environment, really making kind of colleagues feel empowered to do their best at work. So I'm going to kind of sit back, listen as well from Helen's perspective. So Helen, I'll hand over straight to you, my lovely.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So I'm Helen Bailey. Just a little bit of background to me. So I met Stephen last year when essentially what happened was I talked my way onto his podcast. I think I probably said something like, have me on your podcast, I'll be really good. So you can go and listen to that if you would like to judge for yourselves. I'm an L&D consultant with probably far too many years experience, but what I have a real passion for is inclusion, diversity, and I really use those words intentionally. I think those are the things that make organisations tick. They make organisations succeed, and I really want to share that passion. And I think there's a couple of things to me that are really important about it. I think you get a lot of equality, diversity, and inclusion training. I appreciate it. It's a really hot topic, but a lot of it is very much in the kind of compliance, kind of quite dry. And I think there's a lot of conversation in this space. And I think what we're trying to do with these workshops is really get people to think about starting that conversation and having those chats with people. Just in terms of backgrounds and industries, I've probably worked in every industry I can think of, all the way from financial, all the way through to charity, to healthcare and distribution. And my sort of focus, as I said, is on those practical things that people can take away. So you've been promised interaction, so now I feel that I have to deliver on that. So I wanted to start off, and we're just going to jump onto a very quick Menti in the next slide. And just to get you thinking about, she says, fingers crossed. Yay. So the question is here about thriving at work, because we've called these sessions Building Thriving Organisations as Teams. So I just wanted to ask you, what are people saying and doing when they're thriving at work? So I've put in the chat the link, so it's www.menti.com, and then I've put the code in there as well. So you just go on to www.menti.com, and if you put 15676350, you will be able to add something into this. I'm just interested, what do you think people are saying and doing when they are thriving at work? So I'll just give you a minute or so to do that. And there are no right answers. Just what do you think? What would you expect to see? Somebody started us off. Thank you very much. Enjoying work and feel like they're able to be themselves. Happy, productive. That'll come up in just a second. Sometimes it just takes a minute to come over into the screen. I think that enjoying work and feel like they're able to be themselves. And I think when we're talking about thriving, what you get a lot of crossover into the psychological safety element that Amy Edmondson talks about. So that crops up quite a lot. Just give that a click and just see if that'll come up. So other things I can see on my screen, authentic self, happy teams, engaging, productive, happy to challenge, be challenged, good work-life balance, being valued, collaboration. Absolutely. So there's quite a few things that we kind of talk about in this space. So just to kind of build on that, and one of the reasons we talked about thriving, we put thriving deliberately onto this webinar and when we talked about these sessions for a couple of reasons. So when we talk about thriving, it's all those things that you've mentioned, but it's also the opposite of that, surviving. And when we talk about surviving, we talk about quite often this idea of quiet quitting. And I think quiet quitting is very much in the news at the moment when it's talking about that. This idea that people are just about doing enough to get by, and thriving is people being able to give as much as they can of themselves. And if we want to throw in a bit of theory, I said I was all about practical, but I have the odd bit of theory in my head. John Purcell talks about the black box theory and that achieving discretionary effort, which is that little bit above and beyond. And we talked about making things a little less traditional in terms of the EDI space. Thriving is also about the individual and the organization. Yeah, so it's allowing both to do. And while there's a very good moral case for having an inclusive and diverse workforce, there's also a very good business case as well, which we'll come on to in a second. And it is all about that business performance. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to test you a little bit, and I have some questions for you to consider. So I'm just going to ask you to pop the answers in the chat. There you go. There's all your lovely answers there. There we go. So, question 1, and just put the answers in the chat for me. Employees with protected characteristics are more likely to face conflict at work. Do you think that's true? Do you think it's false? Oh, there's typing. That's good. Oh, I think true's getting quite a strong showing here, isn't it? You see, if I had prizes, I think I'm going to direct you to Stephen for the prizes, if that's all right. Happy to help. And the answer is true. This comes from the Good Work Index, which was published this year by the CIPD. I do always I'm all about the evidence, so I do like to show you where I got that from. So if you just have a look at that, that figure kind of illustrates employees reporting conflict at work in the last 12 months. And if you just have a look, so you've got 33% of non-heterosexuals reporting, 35% of disabled, 29% of ethnic minority. I think these stats are really interesting, partly because I look at those and I go, I wonder how much conflict isn't being reported. Because stats only show you so much. And I wonder if this is the tip of the iceberg in this area. And also, how do people define conflict anyway? Is that one bad interaction? Is it a series of interactions? So I think there's some really interesting thoughts about stats. Yes, stats are good, but you can always kind of look at the other side of them. So let's have a look at our next question then. What percentage of neurodiverse individuals feel unsupported at work? So I'm going to give you a whole spectrum to go at. It's a percentage, that's all I'm going to say. So do you want to have a guess and put your number in the chat box for me? Oh, we've got 40, 70, 32, 80. 85? I don't want to say before Vanessa adds a comment in. I don't want to put you off. 70. The actual answer is 49% of neurodiverse individuals feel unsupported at work. So there's a couple of things around this. First of all, to say that 20% of the population are considered to be neurodivergent. Not everybody who would consider to be neurodivergent will have had a diagnosis, because it's really difficult to get a diagnosis. You see, there's a trend at the moment of lots of women getting diagnosed with ADHD who are over 50. There's also a trend of people self-diagnosing on TikTok, and I'm not recommending that in any shape or form, just to be clear. But 49% of neurodiverse individuals feel unsupported at work. If you then combine that with City and Guild's Neurodiverse Index notes that half of neurodiverse people miss work due to a lack of support. So that kind of feels like I can't face going in. It's almost too much. There's a real, I think in a lot of this space, what we're talking about is if you do something which is inclusive, or for a particular group like neurodiverse individuals, it is generally good for everybody. But I think we steer away from that because we're worried about it. We're worried it's going to be challenging. Just to kind of add in this great stat, because this is a great one for kind of business benefit. And this comes from the Zest survey that neurodiverse workforce leads to a 35% increase in productivity. So I'm going to come back to that and kind of talk about some of those reasons why. Okay, next one. Menopause is a protected characteristic, true or false? It's like having my own personal game show, this. It's amazing. Oh, there's a bit of a 50-50 split here. Oh, this is interesting. If it isn't, it should be. I'm with you, Jamil. Absolutely. There was this is a bit of a funny question in a sense because there was a big debate about it last year. But what I will tell you is it isn't. It's an interesting one, this. It's not a specific protected characteristic, but if the symptoms have a long-term and substantial impact, which kind of feeds then into the definition of disability at work. So if that person is unable to come to work, for example, or is unable to leave the house, which can happen, that could then relate to a protected characteristic, and that's how it would work. Really interestingly, a lot of the case law around menopause talks about men saying to female employees, well, my wife didn't go through it like that, so therefore it's not menopause. There's also some interesting case law where somebody was called an old dinosaur because they were going through menopause, or there are some jokes about hot flushes and, oh, it must be your brain fog, those kind of things. Really interestingly, so we have a new government now. I'm loving that reaction, Jimmy. We have a new government now, the Labour government. They have, in the King's speech last week, talked about a huge rack of employment law. It feels like there's going to be a lot of stuff coming. But one of their promises in the manifesto was that they want for all large companies to have a menopause action plan. Which I think is a really interesting stance. And I think, the sort of things they'd be talking about is, menopause champions having a menopause policy, probably having some awareness sessions, which, obviously from our point of view, that's a great thing to be doing. But actually, it's all the other stuff you can do as well. And what I want to say to you again is in this space, it's not always about doing the big, massive things. Sometimes it's the little things that make a difference, thinking about how many sets of uniform are available, putting someone's desk near the toilets, near an open window, having a black cardigan available. I know Stephen and I chatted about this the other week, but this is a really simple thing, having a black cardigan available. So if there is leaks or flooding, then the woman can put that on and it just covers that up, and it's just saving some of that embarrassment that can happen and feel like. Okay, I've got two more. How many working days were lost due to work-related stress, depression, or anxiety in 2023? It's more than 3, if that helps. Okay. Yes, in the UK. Oh, good clarification question. I like a clarification question. Too many? Laura, well done. You've covered all the options. A lot. Oh, I'm loving this. Okay, so it's 17.1 million working days were lost. Okay, so we do the math, and if you do the math, you kind of get to 28 billion pounds in terms of what was lost. And I think what's really interesting about this is work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. And I think you've got all the other things that are going on in the world, again, which I'm going to come on to a bit later. Okay, let's come on to my favorite stat. So no pressure for you to get this right. Whoop. Oh, there you go. Diverse and inclusive teams make better decisions. What percentage of the time? You might have seen that if you were sharp. So it's a percentage, this one. And it's my favourite stat. Go big or go home, Hannah. Oh, Vanessa's so close. So close. 87%. Wow, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want better decision making in an organization? I think, if we think about this, and in fact, I know, do you know what? I'm going to ask you very briefly in the chat. Why? Why do you get this if you have diverse and inclusive teams? Yeah. What are your thoughts? Why are you getting better decision making? Yeah, we get rid of groupthink. Love a bit of groupthink. Well, I don't love a bit of groupthink, but yeah, more perspectives. Different experiences, people feeding in different things. The very last slide I'm going to show you today is a quote from Matthew Syed. And in his book, Rebel Ideas, he talks about a team that was brought together to make the England men's football team better. So this was a few years ago. So I'd like to think we've gone from quarterfinals to finals. So we have kind of made progress in that area. But the idea was there wasn't just football people in the room. There were cyclists. There were Matthew Syed himself is a table tennis player. Then they could all offer what he calls a rebel idea. Yeah. Oh, a bit of growth mindset as well, Donna. Thank you very much. Okay, so you can rest for a minute because I'm just going to talk for a little bit now. I wanted to show you this quote because quite often I get asked about equality, diversity, inclusion training, and people say, we'll just do the managers, we'll just do the leaders. It's bigger than that. And actually, it's so important because it enables everybody to work together in a positive and an inclusive way. So this is not something that is confined to certain, it's for everybody. And I think it's enabling people to start those conversations. I think that's what's important. Quite often when I'm doing this sort of training, the B word comes up, the B word being banter. And in fact, not long ago, I was called the fun police. And really, that's not what I'm about. It's about enabling people to have constructive conversations with each other. And if it's not a constructive conversation, it's enabling people to be able to tell the other person in a way that doesn't, it's not about aggression, or it's about a very civilized, I'm going to call it a civilized and respectful conversation. Yeah, to talk about that. So I think it's really important that we don't kind of limit this to a particular section of the organization. So let's talk about, the offering, and, that's a bit of background to it. I want to start off really by talking about the style. I think the first thing to say is, all the sessions can be CPD accredited. I'm going to talk about them individually in a minute, but I think it's important to note that none of these are kind of all day sessions. We've kind of gone for very bite-sized things. And we can absolutely make these bespoke to your organization. So, and I think that's really important. I always feel that these courses should feel like they're being delivered by you. So if we're talking about inclusion, we are talking about your definition of inclusion. If we're talking about mental health, we're signposting to the things that you have in your organization. I think, and if there are some things, so sometimes what happens with these kind of sessions is that people will say to me, we've had this going on in the organization. Can you talk about that in the session? Then absolutely we can do that as well. Obviously, we don't kind of go, so and so said this. We kind of talk about it in a very general way. In terms of the session, they're very interactive. I was asked a few weeks ago, actually, what the difference is between delivering online and delivering in person. My view is they aren't that different at all. It's just the mechanism is different. So if you go into groups in person, we're going to do it around a flip chart. Virtually, we're going to do it in a breakout room. You would still get the same. So obviously, we use Mentimeter, we do bespoke animations. The content is very evidence-based. I'm really keen that we don't talk about things or stats that were, aeons ago, 23, 24, particularly for the moment, that's where we are based. And then to help people put it back in the workplace, then we've got the workbook. The workbook is really some signposting. So here's some other stuff you can go and look at if you really want to get into this. But then you've also got sort of the key aspects. So if it's about, let's say, challenging microaggressions, there is a kind of some stuff to get you started on that. Because I'm not a big fan of scripting anybody, because I think that sounds weird if it doesn't sound like how you would normally talk. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these sessions. And let's start with the manager content. So here, I've split them up into manager content and team content. But I want to say to you that you could mix and match. So there's some things in the manager content that you could definitely deliver to your team. So things like mental health could easily kind of transfer over, and that's a discussion we can have. Can I just tell you as well, give you a heads up that at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to vote which ones you think would be most useful in your organisation. So it might be, I don't know, if you want to make a quick note or just jot down a quick title as we're going through. I'm just being fair, open and transparent, I guess. I'm role modeling. That's what we're doing. Okay, let's start off with the first one is building a thriving team. Half-day session. This one is all about the principles of inclusive leadership. So essentially, what I want to talk about here is, the way that diversity is intersectional and crosses over a number of different boundaries, and nobody is ever just one thing. Yeah. So I think that's really important, and I think I like to talk about the breadth of this space. So I think we, race and gender very much at the centre usually of this conversation, but let's talk about all the other things: introverts, carers, neurodiversity we've already mentioned, but there is so much other stuff that would kind of feed into that. I think it's important we talk about the definitions, but I think it's also important we do talk about what does that mean in your organisation? How do you see that play out? I think the practical actions, I will always be about the practical. So how do you be an inclusive leader? Yeah. You are curious, you ask respectful questions. You work collaboratively, you hear from the quietest person in the room. Yeah, you enable people to challenge you in that space. And then microaggressions is a word I've already used already, but really thinking about, what are microaggressions in the workplace and going beyond the obvious, and how do you challenge those in a constructive way? I have a client that I work with, and if a microaggression occurs in a conversation, somebody says zinger. I'm not necessarily advocating that for every organisation. It's something they use and it works really well. And it just kind of indicates that something's happened in the conversation. And then they go away and chat about it. So the two people involved. But I think it's those kinds of, using a nickname without someone's permission, I think. Not saying somebody's name because we don't know how to say it. I think a lot of things occur because we're worried about doing the wrong thing. So it's kind of navigating that path. Okay. Our next one is thriving through inclusive hiring, which this morning it occurred to me that I made that rhyme. So I'm very proud of myself now for that. This is a couple of hours. Really, I don't have a diverse team, so how do I get one? Essentially, I'm really thinking about what is inclusive hiring, the value. We've already covered that off here today. What stops us inclusive hiring? I think Donna used the word bias earlier. I couldn't get through a whole webinar without mentioning the word bias, I think, in this space. So that unconscious bias, and how does that feed into the way we hire? The legal considerations, I think there's no getting away from that. The Equality Act, really thinking about how do we create inclusive job adverts and job descriptions, and the space that's really talked about here is gender coding and the way we use language. Yeah. And also thinking about where we place our adverts. There are lots of very specific places you can place adverts if you want to attract disabled candidates, for example. So it's really thinking about, do we actually use those spreads? And then, the shortlisting and hiring and interviews, how do we make sure that is done in an inclusive way? There's, have a diverse panel is one of my first top tips. But also, the interviews, there's a lot of chatter at the moment about sending interview questions out. There's a lot of debate about whether people feel familiar with that as well. But if you're talking, for particularly neurodiverse colleagues, you're really going to be wanting to kind of lay out exactly how that interview is going to work. Is there a quiet space that they can go to if they feel overwhelmed? Yeah, all those kind of things are considerations. And I think, there's a stat about, I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, something like 76, so don't quote me on this, 76% of autistic people want to work, but only 10% do. And I think that's really interesting. That's a whole talent pool that we are not necessarily tapping into. And I think that's an interesting thought. Okay. And as if I was going to make a really cheesy link, I have done brilliantly to our next one, which is empowering a thriving neuroinclusive team. I've deliberately used the word neuroinclusive here because what we are trying to do is create an organization which is neuroinclusive. Okay, so it means that everybody has the opportunity to thrive. We think about how do we do this in a way that everybody can be their best self at work. That's the best way to describe it. Okay. So I think really, that there's something here for me about what does it really feel like to be neurodiverse at work? And I think there's lots of anecdotal evidence. If you think that 20%, as we said earlier, of the population are neurodiverse, but what does it really feel like? And we'll talk about some evidence-based research, a bit of which you've had a look at. I think the other thing here is the supportive strategies which can be adopted in the workplace. So if you're running training events, conferences, how can you make those inclusive? Thinking about things like, again, we're down to the quiet spaces, but sometimes, in the office, you've got those strict lights, it's like kind of this sensory overwhelm going on. In meetings, we don't always give people the chance and the space. So all those things that could really be helpful. And then having this helpful conversation, I like a helpful conversation. But this kind of springs from sometimes when people say that, if you think people have had to work quite hard to get a diagnosis, and then they have to go to their manager and say, I'm neurodiverse, for example, and then their manager says, oh, everybody's a little bit ADHD, that can feel a little bit, I've worked quite hard to have the diagnosis, and now you've kind of just said, well, everybody's like that. So really thinking about having that conversation in a really supportive way, and also what does it mean for them? So I could show you a whole list of characteristics that somebody who has dyslexia, some of their strengths, some of their challenges, and I think the strengths are important, by the way. I think we do need to talk more about that. But that doesn't mean that somebody who's dyslexic, all of that applies to them. Yeah. So it's really, what does it actually mean for them? That's the conversation. How can I help you? It's a very personal conversation. Okay. Flourishing through menopause. So I chose the word flourishing deliberately. I'm probably part of the Davina effect, if I'm really honest. So the word flourishing comes from the traditional Chinese medicine idea, referring to menopause as the second spring. Davina McCall uses it quite a lot in her book, Menopausing. I definitely signpost you to that for free. Really wanted here to kind of get people comfortable because this feels like a little bit of an uncomfortable topic, I think, sometimes for people. Women and men, I don't think it's kind of exclusive to one or the other. I'm really understanding what the terms are. So, the reality of menopause, I think, if I asked you how many symptoms there were, that's not a question for the chat. I'm just have an individual thought about it. There's not any real agreement. But I tell you, the two that we all know about and we'll talk about is the hot flushes and the brain fog. Those are the two that will inevitably pop up again and again. There's something, there's over 200 actual symptoms of the menopause, and some of them are not as obvious as others. So I'm quite happy to share that one of my symptoms is my voice has changed. It's just dropped a little bit. And I suspect I only noticed that because I spend a lot of my time talking, even when I'm not doing this. Then again, it's about what is useful to support individuals at work. We talked about black cardigans, all those kind of uniform issues. Being able to have that conversation. do you have menopause champions? Somebody, the safe space where people can go to. Do you have resources available? Sanitary products in the toilets, all those things which are really useful. And then, the legislation piece. Um, you know, we've talked about some of that, some of the things that have been said and done and the impacts of that. And I think, the menopause conversation is kind of increasing. You're hearing a lot more about it. And I think the case law will also increase as well. And I think I could be talking about menopause in sort of 10 years' time. And I think it might be a completely different conversation because I think people are being more open about it now and happy to share. And I think, the parliamentary research that was done last year tells us a bit like the stat I showed you earlier about or I shared with you about neurodiverse people not coming into work, that people are more likely to mask not coming to work for a menopause related issue because it might be embarrassment or they don't feel comfortable talking to their line manager. So it's really trying to encourage that safe space. And then we get into mental health. So this session, this isn't Mental Health Thursday. This is really about creating an understanding of what mental health is and really being about everybody has mental health. It's just, is it poor mental health or is it good mental health, positive mental health? And the difference between the two is that ability to cope with the what's going on in your life. And if I asked you to Google a picture of mental health, but I don't really want you to because I'd really like you to stay here right now, what you would see is this. Okay. And that's a really interesting because I think that's often associated with mental health, but actually you can be depressed and still like the Spice Girls. Yeah. You can have anxiety and still go mountain biking at the weekend. These things are not mutually exclusive. So you don't have to like the Spice Girls, by the way, but it helps. So really getting beneath, I think, that kind of mask that's going on. Talking about the symptoms, and this is not an attempt to get anybody to be diagnosing anybody else because that's what you get medical professionals for, but really to have an understanding of some of the symptoms. I also think the current climate is interesting, not right now, but just in terms of all the things that are going on, so we've had a cost of living crisis in the last few years. We've had an energy crisis. There was an article I was reading last week which talked about the political anxiety that people were feeling because it felt like we have had, but it felt like we were definitely getting a change of government. There's something about eco anxiety as well, because we're very much more environmentally conscious as well. And then using the algae model, just again to have that supportive conversation. I think this conversation, if I tell you I'm depressed or I have anxiety, that's a more difficult thing than if I say, oh, I've got too much work on. Because I've got too much work on, you can fix it. Yeah, you can kind of help me. You might give some of my work to somebody else, or you might say, let's chat about it. I think depression we can't fix. So it's about what do I do in that conversation? And that's where we go into the signposting. So we start to talk about those things like, have you spoken to your doctor? Have you spoken to a friend? Mental health first aiders. Have you accessed free support? I think a lot of these topics, there's a lot more sort of free resources out there now than there's ever been. I'm just going to pause so I can have a drink of orange before I talk about team content. Is that okay? I'm guessing it is. I'm just going to go, yes, okay. I got a thumbs up from Steve. I'm good. Let's talk about team content. I've really only got two things to kind of share with you around team content. But bearing in mind that anything we've talked about in manager content could quite easily transfer over. I think that's quite important to say. The first one is we've called it enabling a thriving organization. Oh, I'm just going to pause because Jamil's written a great big thing in the chat, and I would hate to miss out and not talk about it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the different types of menopause, you're absolutely right. So somebody who's undergone a hysterectomy or early menopause as well. No, not at all, Jamil. It's really interesting. It's a really good point. So, going through early menopause as well, because often it's associated with a certain age, but recognizing that somebody, and it might have not necessarily a more traumatic effect, but it's a very different effect for somebody who's 20 and perhaps going through early menopause, as it might be for somebody who is in their 40s and 50s and perhaps has had children at that space. Yeah, really, really good point. Thank you, Jamil. So the enabling a thriving organization piece, this is really going back to that quote I showed earlier about how do we get people to work together in a really inclusive way. Again, you'll see a lot of the things that popped up in inclusive leadership kind of then pop up here. So we're going to talk about that intersectionality. Here we're going to talk about individuality and identity to kind of lead us into that diversity. What does it really mean when you have diversity? What do you see in your organization? And then getting into the different types of bias. We've mentioned groupthink already today. Confirmation bias. I'm very evidence-based. I would also know that I've got a very strong view on certain things. If I had confirmation bias, I'm only going after what suits my view. Yeah. As an evidence-based practitioner, though, that would be very against my way of being, if I'm really honest. But there's an example. And how do you get over that? It's an interesting one because mainly it's about awareness and it's about feedback. So those two things are kind of crucial to that. Talking about microaggressions again, the use of language I think is really interesting when we're talking about microaggressions. In my past, I had a manager say to me, "Well, that was really good, Helen, for you." I think the tone that is implied for you, it's kind of, and hopefully Stephen doesn't say that at the end of this. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But the way we use language is really interesting. Thanks, Donna. I can laugh about it now, but I have been in therapy for a long time over it. But also, intentionally we drop into certain types of language. So confined to a wheelchair is an example of that. So when we say confined, it almost suggests that we are minimizing that person's experience. And what does it mean to be an ally at work? I think there's lots of chatter about this. There's lots of chatter about all these topics, but allyship is not intervening for that person all the time. I think that's important to say. It is about understanding where that person is coming from and supporting them. It is not necessarily jumping in. And sometimes you see that sometimes allies tend to kind of, oh, no, I think that's and kind of step in. But it's about supporting, understanding where that person is coming from. There's a lot of curious, respectful question. And I always come back to that because I think that is at the heart of the equality, diversity, and inclusion conversation for me. Okay, one more to go. Oh, there we go. Thriving in a culturally diverse world, because let's face it, we are in a culturally diverse world. This one essentially is all around cultural intelligence. So thinking about the head, heart, thinking about culture and climate. So culture being that stuff at the top of the organization, which is usually your values. And then climate, how is it experienced? Are those values just on the wall or are they actually, lived in the organization? Again, the key terms will always crop up. Then we're going to get into psychological safety because I think that's important. And Amy Edmondson obviously is the key sort of reference here. But do people feel included at work? Do they feel okay to be themselves? And somebody mentioned that, I think, on our very first question. Yeah. Do I feel safe to learn? Do I feel like I can ask a question? Do I feel like I can get feedback? Do I feel like I'm doing meaningful work? Can I see where it's going? And the most important, not the most important, I guess, but the one that crops up more than any other is safe to challenge. Do I feel I can hold my hand up and say, I don't agree with this? And it's okay, it's constructive. And then to kind of get into the reasons for cultural misunderstanding, why do they occur? Sometimes we don't know what we don't know, ultimately. That can be one reason. Sometimes was I going to say there? Because it just went out. I said sometimes and then I kind of paused. I think sometimes we don't say anything for wanting to do the wrong thing. And I think that can cause us some misunderstandings. And I think it's also about how do you overcome that? And some of that is about education. But a really good thing to think about is you can be the most culturally intelligent person in the room, but if you don't use it, so the application is actually really important. And one of the things we'll touch on, there's some really interesting bits and pieces there which talk about Hofstede's done some really interesting research which talks about different characteristics. But again, I'd advise you to look at that with some caution, because it would be unfair to say that everybody in the UK is reserved, for example. Current case in point. Okay, so I asked you to do something while you were listening to me speak, and now I'm going to ask you to vote. So what I'd like you to do is, there we go. Which of these courses do you think would be useful in your organisation? So you can vote for more than one, because I'm feeling quite generous today. So I'm just curious. I've put the code and everything in the chat for you. So which of these do you think would be useful in your organisation? So vote for as many or as little as you would like to. Oh, I'll just move it. Oh, I've got overexcited and moved. There you go. Move that back. That's a pretty strong showing across the board, isn't it? I think we've got a like from somebody as well, so I think that kind of confirms that all of those would be useful. Just give you another minute or so if anybody wants to vote and just have a... That's another sip of the orange juice for me.
It says the code's wrong.
Sorry, Stephen.
Sorry, it was
Jamil.
Jamil.
Sorry, it says when I try and go onto it, it says the code is incorrect.
Oh, have I given you the wrong code?
Yeah, so I think the one on the screen, which is the 59030938, is the one that works.
I've replaced the 6 for an O, haven't I? That's my fault.
That's it, yeah. So I think that's the bit, and then it works.
Apologies, team. You can't have it all, though, can you? That's what I'm going to go there. Which is the one that's not working for you, Hannah? I've just got a lot of thing across there. 0938, that one should work. Don't use the one I've just put in the chat because I've done it again. Honestly. Got overexcited. I don't know.
I think if people can see the one on the screen, then it's 59030938.
There you go.
That's the one. I'm sure it works. Yeah. So thank you, Helen.
Yeah.
There we go. Hannah's in now.
Hey, well done, Hannah. It's not foolproof, is it? Let's be honest. It's just that, yeah, too much fizzy orange. That's what's gone on there. I'll just give you another 30 seconds. Just if anybody else would like to vote. Yeah, we just got a couple of other. Just going to go back and forth because sometimes that helps it pull through on the screen. So actually, what I can see, and hopefully, yes, there you go. Thank you very much, everybody, for voting. Neuroinclusive has come out top. I don't think that's a particular surprise to me, if I'm really honest. I think you are seeing a lot more of that, a lot more conversation about it. I think also if you went on LinkedIn, right now. Again, please don't do it. I'd really like you to stay. But a lot more people are talking about, some of the challenges that they have. People are a lot more open about it in a way that people were being more open about mental health a few years ago. Cultural diversity, yeah, absolutely. I think it's the world we live in now. And then menopause, yeah, mental health isn't going away, and mental health is on the increase as well. I think ever since the pandemic, definitely gone up. There is also a challenge for people accessing mental health services as well. So people are looking for support and help where they can get to. Oh, thriving teams. Nobody loves my thriving teams. I don't worry, I'll get over it not with therapy, just with some, more fizzy orange probably. That's the best I can kind of drag to. So that kind of takes us to the place. Just go over there. Yeah. Just has anybody got any questions before we kind of move into the final couple of slides about what they've seen, anything they'd like to know more about? You can just pop these in the chat, or if you feel comfortable coming off mute. And I can sing the Spice Girls while you have a think about that, if you like. I don't think anybody. Well, also, actually, no, not recorded. No, nobody needs that, do they? Let's give you Hannah's typing. No pressure, Hannah. What I'll do, I will talk about my next slide while Hannah's typing. That seems to be a good compromise, and then I can come back to Hannah's question. I mentioned Matthew Syed. Oh, now you see, now Hannah's just drawn him straight back there because that's a really interesting question. Has HR been heavily dominated by one particular gender or sex? Oh, Hannah, yes. I think so. In my past lives, I used to deliver the CIPD courses at level 3 for HR and L&D, and generally it tended to be more women than men. I don't have any stats that I can refer to in that space. That's just based on my own anecdotal experience, and I don't know why that is. But I've also worked in HR teams that were full of men, so yeah, it's a kind of hard one to say. I wonder, we were talking about gender. It is interesting. Hannah, you and I should do some research on this topic and then make a load of money. That's what we need to do. I do wonder if it's to do with gender coding or stereotyping or, yeah, write a book indeed. Around that. It's like primary school teachers, they tend to be women, yeah, for example. And there's quite an interesting exercise you can do, which is a bit of an icebreaker. Do you know what, Stephen? I've got a whole thing going on here. I can write a book, I can do a TED talk, I'm all over it. But I think, there's quite an interesting exercise you can do. Where you're given a conundrum and it's about a surgeon being a woman. If you went and Googled it, you'd probably find it. But most people would not recognise the surgeon as being a woman. Interestingly enough, there's also the astronomer, Maggie Aderin-Pocock, who said she never thought she'd be an astronomer when she was young because she didn't see any women astronomers on the telly. I can't even say the word, but you know where I'm getting at. So sometimes we don't, we need someone to break that barrier almost. Wow, this is very interesting. I don't want to read Matthew Syed anymore. I just want to look at what's in the chat. This is much more informative. 20 years ago in the UK, there were only 2 orthopedic of a female. I'm going to take that, Jamil, and store it if that's okay, because I'm pretty sure I can find a use for that at some point in my life. Dear. So I'll talk about Matthew Syed. Yeah, Hannah. Yeah, I can see that would be happening. Oh dear. So Matthew Syed talks about these rebel ideas, and I thought this was, a good quote to kind of finish on. I do have one more slide though, so don't disappear just yet. The most exhilarating moments occurred when someone in the room said something unknown to anyone else, when they offered an insight drawn from experiences that was some way unique. In other words, when they offered what is called a rebel idea. something different. That's why you get 87% better decisions when you have a diverse and inclusive workforce. Okay, so I'm going to endeavour to get this Menti code right for the next one. So I just wanted to ask you, you've heard quite a lot today, I feel. There we go. And I just wanted to ask you just to go in and just do one more Menti for me. And it was really, you know, what words would you use to describe what you've heard in this session? And if you haven't got 3 words, because that's the option I've given you, you know, 1 word will do. I'll let you off. We're all friends now, so that's fine. And I will try and endeavour to get this code right so I don't let you down. 5256 8697. I love the idea of a clever rebel idea. Oh, this has been so informative. Thank you so much. There you go. So what words would you describe what you've heard in this session? So if you haven't got 3 words, that's fine. I'd settle for 1, 2, whatever you feel. It would just be really interesting for us to hear those. Oh, some really nice ones in the chat. Hang on. Let me see. Informative, constructive, and rewarding. Thank you, Lorna. I think what we really wanted to do, and Stephen and I talked long about this for this webinar, is really to, I think it's always easy to say that it's interactive, it's informative and all that. And I think we wanted to show you that rather than just saying it. I think that's definitely a better way of doing it. So I know we have some responses because they're coming through. So again, we'll just trick it a minute and I'll just go forward and then I'll go backwards again. There you go. Ah, great. So conversation, insightful, practical, thought-provoking, confidence, great understanding. I think there is so much you can say on this topic, and it, you know, it wasn't my intention to bombard you with it, but it, you know, if it's just made you think about some of those things, and really, from my point of view, just thank you for some of the things you've put in the chat as well, because that's really kind of, you know, brought some things to my attention and made me think. Clever rebel ideas. Oh, I'm having that, Hannah. Thank you so much. But that kind of brings me to the end. As I said, there's so much more to say on this topic. This webinar was really to introduce you to some of these. And if you'd like to have more conversations, then absolutely contact us on the email inquiries. Is it still inspirational coaching as of yet, Stephen?
Yeah, so that'll still be on for this year. So we're changing over actually today to our new email address, but that one's still available for this year as well. Yeah, so people can reach out or direct message on LinkedIn for you and I, Helen. From that point of view, yeah, really good.
We'd love to have more conversations with you about it. And so before I hand over to Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming along and taking part. I always appreciate that. Stephen, I'll leave you to close off.
Well, can I just say that hour's flown past? So a real big thank you to Helen. Thank you for everyone else joining here. Lots of people that I know, but lots of new faces as well. So really, really appreciate it. Hopefully you can see, I think there was a word on the previous side about progressive. That's what we're aiming to do, of actually bring it that inclusivity into the workplace and make people feel comfortable and rewarding, but the benefits for the colleague and the organisation. So from our point of view, just want to wish you the very, very best for the rest of the afternoon. Helen, thank you so much. What pleasure. A great, great team we're making. And just look forward to, hearing from people over the next couple of days or their thoughts from that perspective. So just a huge thank you. I'll stop the recording now, but Helen and I will be on for a couple of minutes if anyone's got any other questions or that.
Absolutely.
But just enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you so much for giving up your time today. Really, really appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.